Hey guys, what's going on? It's Am I Missing Something? I'm Matt.
And I'm Zach.
And if you haven't joined us for this show before, what we are trying to do here is, I will say this, we are not trying to ridicule anybody. We are trying to just understand, is there something that we're missing about a particular band or a particular point in time in music? Just something that we're not maybe 100% clear on that maybe one of you can help us clear up.
Yeah.
So, Zach, what are we doing this time?
So this is, I think, to clarify also further, with this show, sometimes it's something that's popular, that we just don't understand why so many people love it. And then it's the other ways, something that's not as popular and why so many people don't like it. And this kind of falls into the latter, but in a bit of a gray area. It's the Sammy Hagar era of Van Halen, or as many are quick to call it, Van Hagar. Now, Sammy Hagar in 85 replaced David Lee Roth in Van Halen, and the 4 albums that he recorded with Van Halen throughout the 80s and 90s, they all went platinum, they all went number 1, and they had a bunch of hit singles on them. And yet, if you ask a lot of Van Halen fans, they absolutely hate this era. They just trash it. So it's just kind of interesting to look at something that was so popular, yet so despised. I wanted to use this opportunity to kind of figure out why. Why were so many fans kind of iffy about the band? Because I'm going to start this off. There's some pretty damn good Van Hagar era songs. I mean, there's some songs that are pretty rocking that could have, I could have easily seen David Lee Roth sing on, like songs like Pound Cake or Run Around or The Dream Is Over. And then even the poppier songs like Right Now, Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams, which, yeah, they're pretty 80s poppy sounding. They're pretty good.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, at least for me, is the lead singer in a band is always the hardest person to replace.
Well, yeah.
I mean, if you think about any of the times that a band switches lead singers, they normally don't go very far. I mean, granted, you sometimes you hit a home run. I mean, you go Sabbath with Ozzy and then into Dio, or you go like a more recent example where I think it just went downhill. 3 Days Grace when they switched their lead singer. Granted, they're not like, in the same style of music here, but it's kind of like, okay, you had a guy whose voice was very signature, and then it's now somebody just very generic.
It's interesting you say that, because so I think definitely we have to go into Ross versus Hagar. I think that's probably the biggest. And
this is where you fall on one side or the other. For me, actually, another point before I even jump into which one I prefer. It's a very different style of Van Halen. Once again, I'll go back to the Sabbath example. You have Ozzy, which was like a soundtrack to a horror movie in Sabbath, which is what they strived for. But then you switch to the Dio side of Sabbath, and that side of Sabbath is almost like that mythical type vibe to it. It's just very different. And Dave was very 70s guitar driven, heavy, very just very, why am I blanking on the word I'm looking for?
Well, you know what? So there's 2 areas and topics, I think.
Innovative. That's the word.
When you're talking about
Jesus, my vocabulary sucks.
Yeah. So when you're talking about this topic, I think there's 2 areas that you need to touch upon, and I want to kind of bring this out there so we remember to go back to both. There's the quote unquote softened sound, versus as well as Roth versus Hagar. I want to talk about the softened sound first.
Okay.
Because you mentioned about, less innovative, less even hard rock style. But there's 2 areas that I kind of feel the need to call BS over.
Okay.
So everyone is going to be quick to point out the synthesizers, the keyboards that they really relied a little bit heavier on in the 80s.
Well, that's because that's where the 80s went, though.
But not only that, but if you listen to 1984, which I think is one of the band's best albums, Jump, one of their biggest hits, even a song like I'll Wait, which is a slightly deeper cut.
Right.
You could hear that the band was going in that direction.
or were they going in that direction because they were on the outs with David Lee Roth, and this was maybe trying to push him out the door? Like, hey, we want to go in this totally different direction, and you don't.
I'm going to come back to that in a second because it's actually interesting that you brought that point up. So going back to the sound, though, I mean, they still had some pretty rocking songs, too. Granted, I mean, for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, it definitely was more in the rock reign compared to like 5150. But, I mean, it wasn't like they lost any edge. Maybe it wasn't more so just simply, it wasn't that they were going in a more 80s pop style, but they were becoming a little bit more corporate rock.
I don't know. I think it's just the vocal style of Sammy Hagar lended itself to a different sound. Like if you think about where Sammy has gone post Van Halen, I mean the Chicken Foot project that he did, all of his solo stuff, it's not overly. Yeah, there's it's guitar-driven rock, but it's not like competing for the style of Eddie Van Halen. Like it's all very complimentary. Maybe they grew up a little bit, but maybe there's so many maybes here.
Well, you mentioned the word grew up, so some could also argue that a lot will point to like them trying to be a little bit more serious with Hagar.
I don't even agree to that.
Well, no, but that's the point. I think a lot of the critiques that I was reading back to was that with Roth, they were not making any. There was a known fact that they were trying to have fun, but then you have Van Halen who are trying to be taken serious, like saying no, we're a serious band, and yet they would release songs like Pound Cake or videos like Pound Cake that were essentially, showing off sexy models and whatnot. And then even the album title for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, F-U-C-K. Like they were trying to say, yeah, we're a serious band, but yet they were still pretty juvenile to a certain degree.
And that's what makes me think that, they were trying to maybe be more subtle about having fun, but I still think that, it might have been the way that everybody was going at that point in time. Because if you think about the 70s, for a band to come out and do what they did and have, fun and show that they're having fun on stage what was the 70s? The 70s was the era of, I'm going to have like these long keyboard and guitar solos. And, it's all about my musicianship. When Eddie Van Halen stepped out, did Eruption, and it's like, oh yeah, this is no big deal. I do this all the time.
Yeah.
And then they come back from like this what is it, like a minute maybe long solo, and blast through a cover of You Really Got Me, and it's like, no big deal. And then when they come back and they blow the doors off with the rest of the songs on the album, and they're all very short, but Eddie says more in his solos at that point in time than anybody else. I think Eddie was the catalyst for change going into the 80s, but then that change then started to lead like, well, now it has to be structured to a particular point. And this is where I think that, nerds with calculators started to come out and say, we need to start putting some structure to things. And you know what? Van Halen is going to be one of those bands that needs to alter to what the company wants rather than alter to what the band wants at that point.
You brought up an interesting point regarding what the label wants or the business wants. But before we get into that, because I have some thoughts on that too, could we straight up say that Van Hagar was trying too hard, whereas the original Van Halen, it all seemed to come natural to them?
I will say that whenever you try to change members of a band, it is feeling like you have to try. Yeah. Whereas if you have the freedom to pick up a guy off the streets and say, hey, can you sing? You guys have an infinite amount of time to jive together and to make it natural. Whereas if you're signed to a deal and you're working and you need to, granted, they had probably like hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions at this point, pick up a guy and say, hey, sing. Okay, we need somebody who can sing. Can you sing? Great. But then as you're working together, you have to force that relationship to happen. It just doesn't normally come naturally. I'm sure somebody out there in the interwebs is going to tell me, oh, well, it comes naturally to this person or that person. Okay, but great. They're still humans at the end of the day. If Sammy wasn't 100% with Eddie and Alex, it's going to be forced no matter what. You know, we want to still make the money. We still want to go on the road. We still want to make albums, but we're not the best of buds like maybe at the beginning of Van Halen on the first album, that they were like best of, like, I don't want to say best of friends, but they were at least together and you felt that they were together, you know?
Well, so it's interesting to say that, because I was also just like trying to like figure out why the general fan felt so strongly. So I was looking at a lot of message boards, answering like who was better, like which singer was better or why they hate the Van Hagar era. And one fan made an interesting comment where the band revolved around Eddie's so much that it depended on his moods as to the music. So when Van Hagar was softer, it was because Eddie was happier musically, because he didn't have the friction that he might have had with someone like David Lee Roth, especially toward the end. But then when you listen to the songs off of Balance, and even the Human Being song that they did for the Twister soundtrack,
I actually
you
like
could
that
tell.
song.
No, well, it's interesting because those are angrier, more progressive songs. That was during a time that Eddie and Sammy were butting heads and having a hard time recording together. So it's almost like, does Eddie Van Halen produce the best music when there is confrontation, when there is a bit of, I don't want to use the word rivalry, but like even just a bit of angst?
Then maybe, if that's the case throughout the early parts of Van Halen, they were, just butting heads from the very beginning, because shit, in my opinion, the best stuff came early.
Also, I think when I was also researching and just getting a lot of reading the reviews and reading feedback on the Hagar albums, a lot of people pointed out the production of specifically 5150, and a big critique of that album specifically is that it pretty much got rid of the live mix sound that was created by the band's then former go-to producer Ted Templeman.
You can really hear it on "Finish What You Started."
Yeah, and there's
that's
even
very studio.
So, like, if you apparently at that point the new co-producer Don Landy really hated the live mix, so he actually apparently had Eddie's guitar sit equally in the mix rather than have it sit high in the mix and push to the left channel. So it really is
a big problem.
So it lost the live sound.
It's, you know what though? Eddie always, and in any interview that you listen to him talk about him and his guitar tone, that guitar tone is iconic. I don't know if it was iconic back when 5150 was recorded, but it's iconic from the standpoint of how many people just couldn't get the sound in their head and turned all the dials all the way to the right. And then he even says that in certain instances, he had to actually throw one of those foam egg crate things right in front of the speakers to cut down on some of it so he didn't like hurt people's ears when they were playing. But that sound, coupled with his guitar, that was Van Halen. That was the sound. So now you're taking his signature out of the mix and putting it somewhere where it doesn't need to be. It needs to be loud and in both speakers for, at least in my opinion, and I'll say it again, my opinion, for that to be Van Halen.
So it's interesting you said about in the 80s, maybe he wasn't as innovative sounding. I think it's really something important to point out that by the time Sammy Hagar joined Eddie Van Halen, almost every single rock band was trying to replicate Van Halen, replicate the insane guitar solos, the over-the-top frontman. When Van Halen came out with their first album in 1978, you could argue that rock had never heard such a band. Not only Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing, and this might be a good segue into Roth versus Hagar. David Lee Roth, you could argue, was unlike any other frontman at that point in the late 70s. Singers like Robert Plant, who were definitely, you can even argue that he was a more energetic version of Robert Plant and a more sexually obsessed version of Freddie Mercury. He was almost like a Mick Jagger on steroids. When Van Halen came out, it's almost as if it was everything that a rock fan really wanted from rock. in-your-face rhythm section, mind-blowing guitar solo, and a frontman who was so unchained, no pun intended, who was just so like confident and just masculine even to a certain point, who was
comfortable enough to wear a spandex onesie.
He was like, hey, I'm going to sleep with your girlfriend. I'm not even going to try to sneak around your back. It's going to happen tonight. You might as well go home. Like that kind of mentality. It was like the kind of figure that a teen boy obsessed with sex idolized, for better or worse. I'm not saying it's even a good thing. In fact, it's kind of disgusting. And you could even make the point that the idea that David Lee Roth is so over the top that it's tiresome. That by the time the 80s happened, it was like, all right, we get it. You're obsessed with sex. You think you're the greatest thing on this living earth. Enough already. So like I can see how that even like makes people not interested in Van Halen. But at the time, in 1978, there really wasn't such a explosive band like Van Halen. So that by the time Sammy Hagar came into the band, very different, very much more just one of the boys who wants to just jam and rock out and sing his ass off. At that point, when the whole market was so surrounded by bands trying to be like old school Van Halen, for the actual Van Halen to have almost the exact opposite mind frame, it was unsettling.
Right, and I think that's what, I don't want to say ultimately did them in, but it blended you into the white noise. It blended you into everything else that was around, because at that time, if everybody else is trying to do like the old Van Halen, but then the new Van Halen, it's kind of like new Coke. You know, we tried something new. And the people who were fans of Van Halen might have moved on at that point to other bands that sounded like old Van Halen because they were looking for old Van Halen. Yeah. But then the new Van Halen didn't have the fans that the old Van Halen had. And then they had to start getting a new audience, which at that point was an older audience because it was an older sound. Yeah. And maybe because they couldn't sell to the older crowd that they now had, it led to a decline in Van Halen.
Or maybe they were just trying so hard to make everyone happy. They wanted the corporate rock fans who might have been a little too turned off by the wild Van Halen days, but then they still wanted to keep the old school Van Halen fans too. They wanted the, pun alert, best of both worlds.
Ayo.
But they kind of like, it maybe came off as they were trying too hard. Or even Sammy, like, so I think first off, backtrack a little bit. There is no arguing that Sammy Hagar is technically the better singer. Oh, I see you about to pause.
Better polished, less
stronger,
less emotional.
That's fair too. But like, I think
there is no better. I'll say that there is no better because you prefer one or the other.
That's fair too.
They're two totally different worlds of singers.
I think he's a stronger singer though. I think, especially, I mean, now you can't make the argument because David Lee Roth can't really sing.
Correct.
Sorry. But
there's no arguing that.
While you can definitely see that Sammy was happy and excited to be there, definitely having fun working on music with them. With Roth, you can make the point that he just looked and sounded the part, that this was not an act to him. He was.
That is David
the
Lee
life
Roth.
of the party monster.
Right.
And that's what like so many fans at the time idolized or got tired of. Hence why Van Hagar was as popular as they were, because maybe there were fans who were like, you know what? I'm kind of over the cheeseball that's on stage. Side note, or a little bit of a side note, you mentioned about the friction. We started to talk about the friction between David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen. Mm-hmm. And as you might have all heard, David Lee Roth actually participated in a DJ's remix of Jump. Armin van Buuren. Yes. Am I pronouncing that name correctly? Mm-hmm. As if you've listened to our recent episode of Rammstein's review, I am not great at pronouncing things, so my apologies, I pronounced it. But he actually appears on the remix of Jump. Obviously, it's an EDM kind of techno version of it, and he even performed it live with the DJ. To the point where the two of them did an interview with Rolling Stone about the remix. And I thought this was really interesting. David Lee Roth said in this interview with Rolling Stone, he talked at great lengths about his love of dance music, that he's an aficionado of dance music. And quote, "It's the reason Eddie Van Halen and I have had so much friction over these decades. It's the music, the only music I listen to. So I find it so funny to hear him say that because, again, so many people are quick to point out the use of synthesizers and keyboard music in Van Halen after Roth left the band. But really, it was Roth who was so much more eclectic in his style of music, or at least in what he listened to. And you can maybe even make the argument that Van Halen, or Sammy Hagar specifically, was so focused on being a rock singer, while Roth wasn't focused on being any type of singer. He was so focused on being a performer, on just singing music that at whatever point in his life, just whatever he fancied.
Maybe, the more that I think about this, maybe it's the wrong way around.
Are we doing a runaround?
No, we're
not.
No. Bad.
Pun.
Anyway, if David Lee Roth was the one to introduce the keys, well,
I'm not saying that he introduced the keys.
Well,
but,
I'm just saying, let's take this from another perspective. Yeah. If David Lee Roth was the person who introduced the keys, then Eddie didn't like it. So then they disputed, and if they were already on bad terms, then they could have potentially had, that and pushed it out. But and they pushed out David Lee Roth because he wanted to do that. But then if they kept small pieces of it, kind of like as a jab, like, you're gone, but we're still going to use this a little bit, kind of, as a dig. I don't know.
I think it's pretty clear that Eddie was the one who brought in the keyboards. He always loved playing piano too, and and I think that was actually one of the things they loved about having Sammy Hagar is that Sammy could play guitar while Eddie played the keyboards on songs. I honestly don't think Van Halen and David Lee Roth broke up because of musical differences. I think you had let's say 3, because I don't think Michael Anthony really cared either way, even though you can argue he was the secret weapon in all of the years of Van Halen. You had such strong egos in that band.
Yes, you did.
I don't think music even was at the tip of the iceberg as to why they split up. I think it literally was. I think the 1996 VMAs, that train wreck of an appearance where the 4 original members are on stage, to give an award out to Beck.
Mm-hmm.
And literally when you hear both sides of the stories as though like, well, what happened? How did that reunion break up even before it started? It is all just in personalities, in that David Lee Roth liked to dance behind people, or Eddie was like, that's disrespectful, even though he probably was just upset that he was taking the spotlight. Like, I think it was just pure egos that caused that shift.
Yeah. There's so many different things. I don't think we're ever going to narrow it down to just one thing.
Yeah.
Part of it maybe could have been the music. Part of it could have been, like you're saying, personalities. Part of it could have just been like alcohol and drug-fueled mind clouds at that point.
Yeah.
Because once again, whenever you hear the stories, they consistently change. Like, they'll say it this way in one interview and say it this way in another interview, and then the other members will say something completely contradictory, and then they'll change their stories. It's like nobody really remembers what happened. Yeah. But we do know that there was some conflict and some rift, and he left, and now here we are, 2 guys sitting on some couches trying to figure out why the hell Van Hagar is so misunderstood, when all that we're trying to really accomplish here is try to figure out who do people prefer. That's really what this comes down to.
I think it's obvious that a majority of people prefer the Roth era.
And nostalgia is a hell of a drug again.
Yeah, but I think it's a shame because I think Van Hagar definitely did have some really strong moments, even if maybe they were misguided.
Right.
Maybe that's the key too, is that maybe it goes back to maybe they really were just trying so hard to be something that they both wanted and that fans also wanted. And ultimately it just didn't blend.
Right. I think when Van Halen was at its best, Van Halen did Van Halen for Van Halen, not for anybody else.
Yeah.
And trying to be guided by labels and what people wanted, and, trying to do lots of different things. As much of a train wreck as the last album for Van Halen was, I don't even remember the title off the top of my head.
Which, A Different Kind of Truth?
Yeah, that one.
The last album they did of Roth.
Literally the last album.
Well, that last album was mostly just B-sides that they re-recorded with Roth.
But here's the thing, is it shows Van Halen. It shows, while Dave can't sing, Eddie does what Eddie does. And the band did what they did. And guess what? You know, Michael Anthony wasn't on it, but, you know, Wolfgang does a great job, in my opinion. He's not Michael Anthony, and the vocals were subpar, but once again, David Lee Roth can't sing, and you can't have great backing vocals if the real vocalist can't sing, but it shows Van Halen going back to what Van Halen, I would say, loved doing.
You know what? I mean, so I have not seen Roth with Van Halen live yet. I've only seen video footage, and the video footage I've seen with Roth playing with Van Halen now or in the recent years has been just kind of like, man, it's just hokey. It's just them all trying. It's them kind of trying too hard. It's a little forced. With that said, I've seen Van Halen with Sammy Hagar twice when they reunited in 2004. The second time was a little rough just because you can tell that Eddie was back to drinking. So you can tell that not everyone was happy about that. But it was the first time I saw them was earlier in the tour in Philadelphia, and it was a great show. And you can tell that everyone on that stage, whether they, you know, drinking or whatever, they were actually having fun. And I think it goes back to your point of when Van Halen wants to do something for themselves, that's when they're at their best. But unfortunately, that can change.
Nothing stays the same.
It can jump back and forth between what Van Halen wants and what is expected out of them within literally a tour span. And I think that's what makes Van Halen such a fascinating band to follow through the years, to see how much can change with them within such a short time. It's change, not change. I know you're trying to sing it.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
I'm trying. Stop jumping around. I'm bringing that joke back too, and it's great. Everyone loves it. Before we wrap things up, because I feel like we can keep going down this rabbit hole and just still be in the same spot. I think it's fair to say, Matt, that you prefer the Roth era.
I prefer the Roth era when it's heavier. Like I don't necessarily like people will like the song "Beautiful Girls." I don't like that song all that much. You know, there's times and in there that it's like you're doing weird things. Just stop.
Also, I think. Sorry to go back. Also, there are some times of the Roth era too, where you can tell that the albums were like forced, like Divers Down.
Yeah, that was
all
a forced
album.
I hate that.
Yeah,
I hate that album, and I even hate the cover of Pretty Woman. I don't think I like anything off of that album.
It's a Pretty Woman, which I think is one of the most overplayed songs on the radio currently. Listen to past If You Have to Pick 3 episode to find out why. Selfless plug.
Well, but yeah, I mean, there's times there that I don't like that, but I like the Sammy era when, like I said earlier, I like Humans Being. I actually like Finish What You Started. I like Now. That's a very like big and epic song.
So this leads me to a question I want to pose that I'll answer as well. What are your? I'm going to say 2. Why not?
Okay.
Or you know what? 3.
Go ahead.
We're going to blend in a little bit of If You Have to Pick 3. Which 3 songs of Roth and which 3 songs of Hagar do you like best?
Okay. So.
And I'm going to do the same, but I'm making you go first.
Okay. I like from the Roth era. See, now you sprung this on me. Now I'm going to have to dig.
This is fun.
Okay. So I actually like the cover that they did of You Really Got Me.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
Atomic Punk and Take Your Whiskey Home. I really like those songs. The Sammy side, I like Right Now, Humans Being, and Pound Cake.
Oh, yeah, that's a great song too.
Yeah, those 6 songs I think kind of encompass where my mind is.
All right, so for me...
Oh, wait, I switched the last one on Roth.
Okay.
I actually really like Ice Cream Man.
That's a great song too. All right, for me, for Roth, it's Ain't Talking About Love. I feel like that really is the song that captures the band best. In groove, in technicality, and just performance.
Oh, you already have this prepared.
No, but I I think about this stuff way too much. My wife will say, Zach, why? There's so many more useful things you can do. Why do you just store this kind of stuff in your brain? Sorry. Ain't talking about love. I'll wait. Because I think that really showcases the band, how they're evolving in the 80s. And then, you see, I'm actually not that prepared. I'm kind of playing Hot for Teacher. It's a fun song. I mean, that's just the drum. Every time I hear the drum beat, it just sounds so heavy and modern. And it's on the radio. I'm like, ooh, what new song is this? Wait, this is Hot for Teacher? Like, it's just such an awesome song. So that's for Roth. For Hagar.
Oh, and then now there's Panama too that I'm coming back.
I was going back and forth between Panama and Raw and Hot for Teacher. I went for Hot Teacher. For Hagar era, I'm gonna say, Why Can't This Be Love? It's one of their poppier songs, but it's really fun and catchy. Mm-hmm. See, I'm going back. Run Around, because that's a song I could actually hear Roth singing.
Okay.
And it's just fun. And then it's either going to be Finish What You Started or
Come on, baby.
or Right Now. Right Now. Right Now really is a great song.
Right Now.
And I think right now is a great time to end.
Yeah. So are we missing something? That's the main question. Are we missing something? I think that we are missing something, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that the fans, they're clouded by nostalgia. A lot of people who start this argument of Roth or Hagar or Roth, it's just because you want the band to go back to what they were, or you don't like where the band headed, or there's so many ifs or ands. But in the complete scope of what we're trying to see here, yes, I am still missing something about why people dislike one era or the other. They both have moments of being really great, and sucking a big one. Yeah. So
in both eras,
exactly. That's what I'm saying. In both eras, they're great or they suck a big one, and people need to just understand that if you are going to listen to this band in one era, you're going to get it one way. If you're going to listen to it in another era, you're going to get it another way. Granted, you might feel very strongly that the band is going in a bad direction, but maybe they can surprise you in some way in some era, because once I'll go back to the very first analogy that I made in this whole thing is the Sabbath with Ozzy and the Sabbath with Dio. Ozzy Sabbath, nobody can argue. It was great, but there were moments where it wasn't so great. And then on the Dio side, one of my favorite Sabbath songs of all time is Heaven and Hell. But then there's other times where it's just like, I miss Ozzy. Yeah. So you can have it both ways, and it's almost like having two different bands.
I'm going to make a pun. Best of both worlds. Call back.
There you go.
Well, you know what? Let us know what you think. Let us know on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Epic Footnotes. How do you feel about Sammy Hagar's era of Van Halen or Van Hagar? And tune in next time for another episode of Am I Missing Something? We love to hear from you and hope you tune in again. Thanks, everyone.
Take it easy, guys.